We have today Professor John Whitehall speaking to us from Australia, where it's midnight. So welcome, John. And he'll be talking on managing gender dysphoria in childhood. So Professor John Whitehall is the chair of the Christian Medical and Dental Fellowship of Australia, which is one of ICMDA's 84 member associations. He's Professor of Pediatrics in Sydney, and his 50-year career began in Sydney and continued throughout developing countries, and then back to Sydney as a general pediatrician before he focused on neonatology. And then for 15 years, he was Director of Neonatal Intensive Care in Queensland, which included antenatal diagnosis, resuscitation, management, and transportation of premature, dysmorphic, and sick neonates, many of whom were Indigenous. So it's our pleasure today to welcome Professor John Whitehall to talk to us about managing gender dysphoria in childhood, a perspective over 50 years of practice. Thank you, John.
Oh, okay, thank you. And thank you, Peter, for inviting me here. You know, I've just been sitting quietly before all this started, and prayerfully, quite frankly, and praying in the words of St. Paul, that I would have clarity of expression. It's difficult speaking over the Zooming type stuff. I teach medical students and it's not easy, and I really want to give a clear message. And then I was thinking about St. Paul, and he and I don't have too many things in common in many ways, except that we worship the same risen Lord. But I have a sense of privilege of being with you, and I wondered whether that was what he felt. And I flipped through the introductions of these various letters, and I could see he felt that too. He felt a privilege in the fellowship, a joy in the fellowship. And he was saying to a number of the people, he rejoiced in the blessings and the things that God had given these people. And I rejoice in that Christian fellowship. I rejoice in the gifts that God has given you for his service, and me, being members of the medical and dental profession, and therefore the openings of the service that we have. And I give thanks for this fellowship, and my prayer goes out to you, as it did in many of the epistles there from St. Paul, that he would give you grace and peace. And as well as that, there is endurance and wisdom, because we certainly need wisdom and we need endurance. We need clarity of thought with this new business that has arisen, which is childhood gender dysphoria. This is new. As Peter introduced me, I've been in pediatrics for over 50 years, and I never saw this. In fact, I have never had a mother or a father come with a child and say, you know, Jimmy's complaining that he's a girl. I never had that. But in the past, when I was in general pediatrics, people would come with all kinds of embarrassing problems. You know, Jimmy is masturbating in public, or my beautiful little girl is masturbating on the toy bear or whatever, or they're playing with themselves or whatever. People were never reticent in declaring these embarrassing things and wondering what they should do about it. But nobody ever came and said, he thinks he's a girl, or the other way around. When I got interested in this, now I've got a little message saying we're having trouble with the French and Spanish translation. Am I speaking too quickly? I'll go a bit slower. So I was saying that this is rare. And when I became interested in 2016, because I happened to walk past a presentation at a physicians conference in Australia, I polled 28 of my fellow pediatricians in Australia. And I said, look, you know, what do you think about this gender dysphoria stuff? Do you believe in it? Is it real? Have you ever seen anybody? So 28 pediatricians with a cumulative experience of the best part of 1,000 years. they could recall about 10, and that's it. 8 of them they recalled because of the severity of associated comorbid psychiatric disease, and 2 of them because they had been the hapless recipients of grotesque and prolonged sexual abuse. And indeed, in those days, we were always told if a child is protesting he's of the opposite sex, you worry about child abuse. So from then, it's now involving in Australia, they don't publish the figures, but probably 1,000 new children every year, just gone up exponentially. You know that as well as I know it, or we wouldn't be talking about it. So where is the source of this problem? I think it can only be understood as an ideology. It can only be understood as a utopian ideology, and only really understood as an alternative to the salvational process of Jesus Christ. I think we minimize the problem unless we see it in that grand sense. This is an ideology which says, well, we can see what is wrong with human nature. Sexuality has been oppressed, and therefore it is our holy duty to free up those repressions, and in the process we will have heaven on earth. It's in a sense saying yes to the 3 temptations that Jesus denied. His way of salvation was what you know, through the cross. This is best understood as a salvational utopian ideology, because in understanding in that way, you get some idea of their zeal and of their commitment to it. So having said that, what is the ideology? Well, with regard to children, essentially, it is that of gender fluidity, and that there's no such thing as binary entities of males and females, but everywhere is somewhere in between, and the in-between can move, it's fluid, but there's an inconsistency. It can only move away from congruence with chromosomes. It can't move back. It can move in an outer direction in many ways as you can conceive. And now they're talking about 20 or 25 different genders or so forth, and you can change them really as often as you have the feeling you want to change it. Now, it wasn't not just an ideology, but I'll come to this. It's become a political force because devotees have caused laws in many countries, and in Australia, laws are being passed, have been passed, to enforce this ideology. And we'll get to them. The courts have been persuaded for it, and the medical board in Australia is persuaded for it. And already I've been called before the medical board for creating community distrust by arguing against the ideology of gender fluidity. It is becoming a very significant political force. And because it is essentially anti-Christian, it is becoming a major force against the church. I've never seen in my lifetime in Western countries this organized, legally backed, determined force to do away with the gospel of Jesus Christ. So let's move on. Who was involved? Well, it used to be that there were boys, it was mostly little boys who were involved. There was he's still alive, a child psychiatrist in Western Australia who wrote in 1985 of his experiences over there with 8 children. That's it, only 8, and 7 of them in 5 years, and 7 of them were boys. And similarly to the works of Candice Zucker, who until recently ran a gender clinic in Toronto until he's effectively sacked, they found that it was mostly boys, and they discerned an unusually high percentage of personality disorders in their parents, in particular the mother, and the almost unanimous family disruption. For example, in Koski's case, looking at these 8 children, now mind you, that was 8 children over 5 years, and now that very same hospital has 2 or 3 new children a week. So Koski's observation, they're mostly boys, and it went like this. The mother had been badly treated by males and didn't particularly like males, found that her little boy was more agreeable to her when he was more like a female, indeed dressed like a female. And that's how it began. And the little boy, being perceptive of these things, the way to bring a smile to mum's face, he would go along with this. And so there was a symbiosis of pathology in that sense. Now, that was only disrupted when the child was actually put into hospital. Now, you couldn't do it that day, these days. But I'm bringing out then that this was, in those days, more of a pathology in the parents with the young, in particular, boy. Now it's different. The people who are presenting are, on the whole, teenage girls. The pathology is, well, the prevalence of pathology is no different. It's not so much the parents now, but is the pathology in the girl. And no matter how you look at, no matter what surveys you look at, these are troubled girls. 75% of them in some people's surveys have had diagnosed mental comorbidities, not just anxiety and depression, but even actual schizophrenia and psychosis. That's a minority, but the majority have got are vulnerable psychologically. So, and I'll give you an example. I was involved in a court case. I need to be careful of how much I say here. In a court case in Australia, there was a girl involved, and everything had been really terrific. She was the apple of their eye, and until puberty began. Then she was an athlete and found that she couldn't keep up with the boys, and this annoyed her, and she was saying, I wish that I was a boy. Not that she, or at least had the capacity of a boy. She became a bit resentful, but then also she developed anxiety and depression, as is not uncommon. This time of puberty, with the changing of hormones, is known to precipitate mental confusions, in mental disease, comorbid things in young people growing up. So this happened to her, and she ended up with a list of diagnoses as long as your arm. And in the midst of that, she was watching the web. She was addicted to the web. And she would then, because on one click on the web these days, you can get pornography, she began watching hardcore pornography. And then ultimately, she declared to her friends that she really thought she was a boy, or wanted to become a boy. And when you look at these websites, you can learn the script. So she was in the wrong body. She was going to commit suicide. She announced that she was going to buy the rope. She hadn't bought the rope, but she was going to buy the rope, and she was going to commit suicide in this time. And her web mates then told the police, and then lo and behold, the police turn up in one day. It blindsided the parents completely, and they took her away. So she was then under the custody of the state. She has turned the age where she can now, she's alleged to be Gillick competent and can make her own decisions. And those decisions, as sure as tomorrow will follow tonight, will involve cross-sex hormones and ultimately surgery. I mean, she's already binding a chest. She's on the process. She's on this escalator, which will lead to her transgendering. So there are certain principles in this. One, she was vulnerable, psychologically disturbed. Two, she learned this business, I'm going to commit suicide, which is a very powerful manipulating tool. She showed no evidence of this before, nor did she really show evidence that she was likely to commit suicide. She said that she had taken 2 packets of paracetamol, which works out of 500 milligram tablet, like 3 times the toxic dose for her weight. But when they put her into hospital, she had very low levels. The obvious conclusion is, and the state, the courts and everything were saying, well, she just didn't absorb it. But really, the other thing is it was more likely to have been a scripted thing. If you don't, look, I'm serious, I'm going to commit suicide unless you do all this. So there is, in fact, no evidence that these children are more prone to suicide because of gender dysphoria per se. Now, this girl came from a Christian family, so there wasn't family disruption, but she had diagnosed mental illnesses all the way along. And of course, she was vulnerable. And of course, in reality, she may well have had suicidal intentions. But what I'm saying is that per se, there is no evidence in any of the literature that gender confusion by itself is associated with an increased risk of suicide. Anyway, the poor girl, backed by the state, no one's going to be able to do anything about it. She will now start on their management, the mandated, the only legal form of management in many states of Australia and in other countries. So it's not a matter of talking about what management options there are. We're talking about the mandated, and to go against this in the Australian Capital Territory and also in Queensland as one of our states, and likely coming soon in Victoria and South Australia, there is no legal way of managing it unless you affirm the child's confusion. Unless this girl thinks she's a boy, unless you affirm that, you are in breach of the law. You are making a criminal act. It is now become, in several of these states, a criminal act to not put the child under the process of affirmation. So you sin by omission if you delay, or you sin by commission if you try individual or family psychotherapy. So what I'm moving to now is a review of what affirmation therapy is in Australia and indeed in England and United States and other Western countries. That's what I'm moving from. I have done the introduction. I've done who is involved. We're saying it's troubled girls in particular now, and now we're looking on to the mandated form of treatment. What are they going to do with this girl? Well, they have already started the process of social affirmation. They've given her a new name. They've given her new clothes. The state is provided for all this. They've provided a house for her, in fact, and there are special toileting for it and everything. You're supposed to use the pronouns and everything. The state declares that everyone is now mandated to affirm this girl child's identity as a male. Now, she is 16 and puberty's already started, but had it been earlier, they would have used puberty blockers. We haven't got time to go into the physiology of it, but very simply, the hypothalamus secretes gonadotrophin releasing hormone, which goes to the pituitary. The pituitary then releases follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. They go in your blood to your gonads, and they cause testosterone and estrogen to be released. Now, that's that vertical pathway which initiates puberty and maintains sexual characteristics. But in the courts in Australia, and indeed I've looked at it in England, the Tavistock court, for example, at the minute, they don't tell you, they don't refer to the abundant evidence that GnRH does not just have this vertical thing from hypothalamus to gonads, but it goes horizontally. The axons of the cells in the hypothalamus that are producing the GnRH actually travel to the limbic system. And there have been shown receptors to that hormone throughout the cortex and the limbic system, and indeed other parts of the body. So the GnRH which you are blocking is not just the vertical business, but the horizontal thing. Well, what does that mean? It means that it has a role in the limbic system. What on earth's that? The limbic system integrates emotions and cognition, things of your thinking, sense of reward, and sense of what makes you happy, sense of what makes you unhappy, and brings memories to bear. And it coordinates this into, I use the word soul, but I don't mean that in a theological sense, but it is a kind of an emotional, cognitive, who I am and what is my worldview. This is formed, and how do I remember, is formed by the limbic system. Well, hang on, the limbic system receives axons from the hypothalamus. What happens if you block that? Well, you people living in England are lucky. You could go and visit the university in Glasgow, the veterinary laboratory, and you could see what happens when they give the blockers to peripubertal sheep. It affects their limbic system. And we haven't got time to go into it, but the sheep don't behave the same way. They lose their memory. They can't find their way through mazes as well. So cognition and spatial memory is interfered with. And even more seriously, when you're talking about gender dysphoria, the male sheep are much more gung-ho, and the female sheep are much more emotionally labile. They're vocalizing more, passing urine more, skittish and so forth. Well, why are they giving this in the first place? They're giving it to block puberty, allegedly, so that the child can have more time maturely to consider and come to the conclusion of who he is in life. And yet you are interfering with the limbic system. They've taken samples of this, sent it to laboratories in Oslo, and shown that many genes, the function of many genes, are interfered with in this limbic system. Now, that's not the end of the story. There's more story to it. Pfaff, a US worker in, I don't know, I can't remember, university in New York, he showed a long time ago that there were midbrain centers that were related to GnRH. And if you stimulated them by themselves, they caused a sexualized behavior. So they were kind of primary centers of sexual identity, dependent on GnRH. You're stopping them as well. Also, you are stopping the secondary release of testosterone and estrogen. So everyone knows when the hormones flow at puberty, that's when you go mad and you're all birds and bees and beauty and all that sort of stuff. It's the sexualization of the secondary ones, which are then blocked as well. So we are saying that you are you're putting the child on blockers in order to help it work out whether it's a girl or a boy, but you are messing with the limbic system. You are stopping the primary center of sexualization, and you're stopping the secondary sexualization. Yes, but there's even more. They found there in Glasgow that these sheep preferred the familiar as opposed to novel challenges. Well, if you transpose that to the transgendering business, you've got this troubled girl, you block puberty and all these sexualizing things, and you have made her prefer the status quo. and to be frightened of change. Well, what's the status quo? The status quo is that you have affirmed her as a boy. Do you see the problem? So there are a number of these. Does it get better when they stop it? In the courts in Australia, the courts in England and in America, the proponents of this keep saying, the blockers are safe and entirely reversible. And we use them to allow time for a mature decision. I've already talked about it. Are they safe and reversible? No. The Glasgow people showed that the effect on the limbic system, on the brain, the cognition, all of that stuff was sustained. The sheep never got over it. Now you can say, why don't they talk about this in the court? Well, I don't know, but in England right now, in the Tavistock case, 2 detransitioners who went through all this are now saying, you didn't tell me about this. If you'd have told me about all this stuff, I wouldn't have got myself transgendered, and you didn't tell me. And the Tavistock case is wide open for liturgy because when I have read the documents, they, like the Australian people, are not declaring all these side effects. Is there more? Yes. The girl, it's a bit late for her to start on the blockers, although they might do it to cut down on the release of estrogen. They're going to start her on testosterone, cross-sex hormones. Are there any side effects on the brain of cross-sex hormones? The proponents in the courts never mention this, never. They talk about testosterone thickens your blood, predisposes to thrombosis, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, blah, blah, blah. Go on. Never one word about the effect on the brain. And yet in 2006, Hulshoff, Poll and others showed that if you put a male, an adult male we're talking about, on estrogen, the brain shrinks at a rate 10 times faster than aging. The female brain hypertrophies. It's not that they're getting more gray cells, but it is thought, and you can't do biopsies to work this out exactly, it is thought that it is due to microtubular enlargement. So there are pathological changes in the brain. This is corroborated by serology, which has shown that brain-derived neurotropic factor, a funny hormone which is released in the brain to cause it to grow, it is reduced in those males. So the males don't have the BDNF, and they also have higher rate of apoptosis. Well, what am I getting at? The structure of the brain is changed, but people don't mention that. This is, okay, so I must conscious of the time. They don't mention that. So what, and then the next thing is the surgery. Well, this girl, the sad girl, she is looking to have her breasts removed. She is basically old enough. Although you were supposed not to do irreversible surgery in Australia under the age of 18, they get around this. Can you believe this? The courts say, well, they have, that we know of, they have given approval for 5 girls, 6, to have their breasts removed under the age of 18. 2 at 15, 2 at 16, and 2 at 17. How can they justify this? They say the removal of the breasts is not an irreversible process. Well, what are they talking about? Well, what they're effectively saying is that the human breast can be reduced to silastic cosmetic appendages. So there is effectively no age limit to it. That is what this girl is looking for. Now, is this going to make her happy? You know, in all my years of medicine, until I got involved in this mess, I had never heard a doctor say, I'm going to do something which is going to give immediate happiness. I'm going to take your appendix out and you're going to be happy. Or I'm going to cut your leg off and you're going to be happy. I'm going to give you antidepressant pills and you're going to be happy. Nobody says that. But actually, and I think this can only be understood with this utopian zeal that these people have, The girl I'm just been talking about in court, her proposing psychiatrist said, we start on testosterone, there will be immediate happiness. And as her physical changes under the estrogen progress over the years, the happiness will continue. Can you believe that? And he's saying that this girl will be able to then develop mature and adult relationships, and she'll be able to look after herself. He's saying that already she's showing maturity of behavior and maturity. She is, now that she's affirmed herself as a boy, she can look after herself. They're saying this in court. She's not looking after herself. She is in a state-funded house with several other transgendering young people. They have given money every week. They are provided food, bed, somewhere to sleep, somewhere to live. They don't even have to get out of bed in the morning. And in the process, surprise, surprise, are we surprised? She's given up going to school. And in the process, with all this excess money, are we surprised? Alcohol has made its way into this house, and marijuana. Yet the state thinks that it is doing a wonderful thing by encouraging this girl to live by herself. And look how mature she is. Look what Gillick competence she has, because she's making all these decisions for herself. This is complete and utter nonsense. But that's the state of affairs. Well, is it going to make her happy? That's the issue. What is the evidence? Well, they don't like you to talk about this. And we've tried to talk about it in the courts, and they don't want to know about it. But in Sweden, for example, the rate of suicide is 19.6 times that of the general population in people who have transgendered. There's a similar study out of Belgium, and the rate is even higher. So and most of these people have got comorbid psychiatric illnesses. The proponents for all this say, well, that's society's fault, because society, you don't recognize them and you don't affirm them and all that sort of stuff. But in Sweden is one of the most affirming societies, and the rate is still 20 times. Can there be another reason for such disillusion that is driving these people to suicide? Well, yes. They didn't find gold at the end of the rainbow. They went through all this trouble, got themselves operated on, body changes, blah, 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 and there was still no happiness. And look what they have done for themselves. Now, they don't like you to talk about this, and they don't like you to talk about, well, hang on a second, you gave them blockers, which interfered with their limbic system in a sustained manner. You gave them cross-sex hormones, which also interfered with the structure of the brain. Could it not be that all the interference with the brain is an iatrogenic cause for the disaffection and the disillusion, which is causing an adulthood? So it is not, the results are far from reassuring that happiness is given by this. I must move on. Are there any alternatives? Well, the traditional alternative, for example, by Candice Zucker in Toronto, was individual and family psychotherapy, a prolonged process of trying to work out why the child is confused and how can we make the child, in his words, and I spent a whole morning with it, talking with him a few years ago, how can you make the child comfortable in the skin with which it was born? Now, I said that in court the other day, and you know, they sneered at me. They sneered at somebody who would actually say, well, surely it's better to try and bring the mind into congruous with the chromosomes than it is to go through the whole transgendering process. They sneered. And that's, well, anyway. I still haven't gotten over my surprise that this was the state sneering at the alternate opinion. Well, this worked. For example, Zucker's outcomes, everybody's, even in the DSM, Diagnostic and Scientific Manual of Mental Health, it declares that basically the large majority of children will assume an identity or develop, mature into an identity congruent with their chromosomes. If you wait long enough through puberty, that will happen. A number of them will end up with homosexual orientation, but almost all of them will lose the transgendering mental preoccupation. So it's a matter of doing that. Now, getting to the laws, and I'm coming to an end, the laws in Australia will prevent you from doing that psychotherapy with, mind you, looking at the social problems caused by the disrupted family, which is almost ubiquitous, and also the mental comorbidities. You have to treat them as well. The laws in Australia are saying that this is conversion therapy. This is the buzzword. And to practice conversion therapy is a criminal act. 18 months in jail in Queensland, 12 months in jail in Canberra if you practice conversion therapy. What on earth's that? We don't want to do that and go to jail for 18 months. It is a Orwellian misuse of terminology designed to confuse. It basically means if you do anything which delays the affirmation towards the chosen sex, if you delay that, or you seek to avoid it, or you sit down and do the old-fashioned psychiatry, that is called conversion therapy, and it is supposed to be a terrible thing, looking back at the medieval concepts of coercive and aversive, punitive attempts to reorientate homosexual desires to heterosexual desires. This is a medieval concept which does not apply, is not practiced in Australia. Nobody does that anymore. Electroconvulsive therapy, nobody gives hormones, nobody gives surgery, castration. Or do they? Hang on a second. Who's giving hormones to try and change sexual identity? It's the affirmation process. Who is removing breasts? Who is ultimately castrating chemically because you become infertile on all those hormones? Who is actually castrating these days? It's the affirmation process. The irony of this is almost overpowering, but you can't convince them of the reality of it. So laws have been passed. You can't practice conversion therapy. In the Australian Capital Territory, laws were passed 2 months ago. Draconian laws, I couldn't believe it, where they have down there said, okay, we have a human rights, like a list of human rights that we love, but we are now going to reduce those human rights because of the greater need of looking after people with gender dysphoria. Now, what are those rights? They are going to, and I'll go quickly, they are going to apply a criminal charges to anyone involved in the delay or the attempted reorientation of a child to its chromosomes. Anyone. This is nowhere else in the world have done that. They've always said medical therapists, but this is anyone. Who's anyone? Parents, grandparents, school counselors, Christian school counselors in particular, because the Christian issue is what particularly annoys them. So at school or so forth, anyone can go to jail. Now, how does this happen? Basically, by doing what I'm doing now, by arguing against this concept of gender fluidity. The medical board hasn't passed these laws yet. Well, they're not actually laws, but code of conduct. But soon we expect them to pass the code of conduct, which will say that no doctor or any doctor will be considered to be unprofessional if he or she makes public broadcasts that diminish distrust in the profession, in the perceived wisdom of the profession. And then it goes on to say, it will be unprofessional if he undermines community trust. Now, when I got called before the board, it was essentially that. I'd undermined community trust by interviews that I had given on the radio that called into question the ideology of gender fluidity and this whole business of hormonal treatment. So I've already been before the board. We are waiting for a new code of conduct to come out, which I'm sure will be ratified by states' laws saying that it is illegal to speak in the way I'm speaking to you now. So free speech was reduced in the ACT. Also, and here's where it really cuts close to the bone. In the privacy, they are saying that we recognize the human right for privacy in the family, but this does not pertain to issues of conversion therapy. What are they talking about here? In the broader sense of the sexualization that they want to defend, it's not only that you can choose to be a boy, or if you're a girl, or you can choose to marry a boy if you're a boy, but it also comes out into the expression of sexuality. You want to have sex, then you should have sex. Nobody should be able to constrain you, let alone your parents, so that it is within the framework of this law that, let's say you were a Christian family and you wanted to counsel your troubled teenager and you were going to advise sexual restraint, and that teenager was now on the web talking to all his mates, and they're saying, well, you have abusive parents because they're trying to contain your natural sexual desires. Then he complains and it goes up a business, and so that mob come and say, you, in the privacy of your home, we agree, but nevertheless, you practice conversion therapy because you were trying to contain the sexual expression of your offspring. Do you see where it's gone? It's into the family. Now, even more than that, you could say, a Christian family, they might want to leave Canberra and go somewhere else. If you transport your child out of the jurisdiction of Canberra for the purposes of conversion therapy, 12 months in jail. So it's unbelievable, the laws that have passed in Australia just recently. More laws are pending. Hardly anyone in the press commented upon it. Hardly anybody in the church can in fact see the challenge to the church, because it's not only what we are teaching the children, but it is our very doctrine. Be you, what is the verse? No. Be Romans 12, number 2. Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. What they are doing is seeking to make illegal a fundamental of Christian belief, that by the power of God, we can be transformed. Our minds can be renewed. We can't do this by ourselves, we all know that. But we are proving the will of God by submitting to it. There are laws now in Australia that effectively challenge that great basis of hope that we have in the gospel of Jesus Christ, that we can be saved, we can be forgiven, and we can be transformed.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, John. We've been listening to Professor John Whitehall, if you've joined us during this, on managing gender dysphoria in childhood. And we're going to take questions very shortly now. John has given us a fascinating historical perspective over 50 years experience as a pediatrician, saying, and I remember this too, years ago, this was extremely rare. It was little boys only. And if there was a dissonance between what a person believed they were and their body, then what you did was offer them psychotherapy for the person and their family to help the beliefs align with the body. And the problem is the approach is completely different now. It's largely teenage girls that we're talking about. We're seeing a new ideology which has developed out of the sexual revolution, and a high number of these girls have psychological comorbidities like anxiety, depression, and other conditions. And what we're doing is giving them these largely unproven treatments involving the blocking of gonadotrophins, sex hormones, and also sex change surgery. And those who hold to the old approach to this, the historic approach, are being demonized and criminalized, being forced out of practice or threatened with jail sentences for offering for what is now termed conversion therapy, but used to be called psychotherapy. So thank you for that historical perspective that you've given us, John. And we've got some questions here. First one from Indonesia. Marissa Resulta asks, as a Christian pediatrician, how do we advise or counsel a child or parents with regard to gender dysphoria? So there's a question coming right from the clinical coalface, John.
Well, in Australia, it's difficult because you've got the laws. However, I think it's nothing unimaginable about this. It's a matter of sitting down with the child and slowly over a period of time trying to work out where this confusion arose from. It's seeing the child in the context of the family, because the family influences, certainly in the old days, were very real when this was a small boy, for example. And what we already mentioned, maternal psychotherapy was not uncommon. These days, if it's a girl, the issue of access to pornography in the West, I don't suppose you've got that in Indonesia. You might be lucky, I don't know. But the role of pornography needs to be investigated. Other people are saying that this is almost ubiquitous. Like, these kids can just press one button on the computer and they're onto really hardcore stuff. And the question is this affecting the girl? And is the girl, in fact, now so disturbed by this, so frightened by this, that, in fact, she would rather join the more powerful side? These things we haven't begun to disarticulate. And I think that we need to, and the only way we can do it is by means of prolonged talking with the child and talking with the family and so forth. So traditional psychotherapy with attendance to comorbid mental disease, this is what we have in the past, and this is what we have in the future. But, you know, the problem in our society, in Australia anyway, is getting the kid off the computer, because that's a daily, hourly dose of the dark web and the communication with those sorts of people. This is a big issue. It's somehow or other, and I don't know how to do this, and I fear for my own grandchildren who unfortunately have got access to the web. I fear for them. I fear for young people in Australia. How can we get them away from the web? This directing influence. So in Australia,
yeah, I was just going to say, yeah.
But there's also schools in Australia. We should then be campaigning in the schools, because in the Department of Education, New South Wales, for example, there's a so-called Safe Schools program, anti-bullying. Yeah, that's the camouflage. But what they're doing is saying, well, you know, who are you bullying? You're bullying this little person. He doesn't know whether he's a girl or a boy. You may not know you're a girl or a boy. Anyone can be somewhere between being a girl and a boy. This is preaching into the schools. There is a law being brought out, maybe passed, I hope, in Australia, or in New South Wales, that a parent should have the right to know what their child is being educated, not only reading and writing, but all this so-called personal developments. So what can we do? We can do the individual counseling, but there are many of these public issues that we have to get involved with. Otherwise, we're losing. We're already losing.
Yes, we have a whole ideology, don't we, that's being enforced. Now, John, you mentioned Dr. Candice Zucker in Toronto and his long-standing clinic that was dealing with these sorts of problems and how he was shut down and unable to practice any longer. Are you aware of other psychotherapeutic approaches that have been developed and researched to aimed at exploring and resolving dysphoria rather than affirmative therapy? Can you point to other researchers or workers around the world?
Oh, well, there are people in Australia who still very courageously practice that. There are psychiatrists that I know who and we are trying to get together to put out, okay, you don't have to run down the affirmative process. Here is an alternative form of management based on that. And we are intending to do that to be able to present it to the government. So in terms of what you can do, there's all this public engagement that we are far behind in yet, and we have to catch up.
How can churches best support parents whose adolescent children, particularly girls, say they want a transgender? There's a lot of pressure now within churches, aren't there? And children being put up against their parents or their carers.
No, I agree. And I could only say that the church should advise the seeking out of a counselor with a good counselor who would go into it in the way we were just talking about. I don't see that the church can really do anything else but to do that. The church, we in the church must realize the degree, the gravity of the threat that we are facing. They're seeking to destroy us, no less. And the church's responsibility should be, again, in a public area, not just involved with that one person who's coming along with a troubled daughter. The whole of the churches should be getting together and recognizing this threat and engaging with it in public, like discussion of the so-called religious anti-discrimination laws and things like that. We've got to get public. We are losing. That's my conviction.
Part of the problem has been that medical groups, I mean, you mentioned about how the DSM has been changed, also the ICD, International Classification of Diseases, to redefine what we used to call gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. The British Medical Association in the UK have voted to support self-identification of gender. Is this an evidence-based approach or sentiment-based? And how should Christian members of the BMA be responding to it?
Well, the same applies here, certainly to the AMA, who came out along these lines, and also the FRA, the College of Physicians, came out along these lines. They never, for example, physicians, of which I'm a member, they never came around asking people's opinion. I don't know anyone whose opinion was asked. So you have a small group of people who make this decision and speak in the name of the whole organization. This is a problem that we have. And this is a problem I faced with the court last week. Your College of Physicians says this, the AMA says that. How do you answer that? And I would say, well, they never sought my opinion. They never sought anyone's opinion that I know. So therefore, we have to get active in those organizations and say, well, we don't agree with this. There were 200 of us who signed a petition to the Federal Minister of Health here, asking for an independent inquiry into the management of childhood gender dysphoria. And we brought out all these published side effects and so forth. And essentially we demanded that he do something. Well, he did something. He passed it to the College of Physicians. And their little committee came out and said, well, we don't think there should be a public inquiry because that's going to upset people. And so then he passed it to the states ministers, and it's still going around. So we who would oppose this have to, we have to keep fighting. And it gets wearying. We're in human sense, we're losing all the time. We've got to maintain our inner strength and endurance and keep up the fight. Like in Ephesians 6, we've got to stand, and having stood, we have to continue to stand, and we have to fight with all the armor of truth and so forth. And it is a matter of us encouraging each other to continue in the public fight. Because in the public fight, we're going to win this or lose it. Because if they make it illegal and they really enforce that, then we're not going to be able to have individual and family psychotherapy. We'll go to jail.
Certainly the impression we had here in the UK was that a couple of years ago, this was all being steamrolled through at a great rate, and there was no real opposition to it. But now we're seeing in the UK a huge amount of opposition, not just from Christians, but from women's groups, from those running women's refuges who are worried about vulnerable women, from people who are detransitioning. You mentioned the two who brought a court case at the moment to the High Court in Britain, who say that they were not properly advised about the side effects of the treatment, and that there was very little evidence that it worked or improved things. So I think we're starting to see the beginning of a turning back. Lots of professionals now in the UK very upset about what's happening in places like the Tavistock Clinic. And I know, John, you've been very, very active in Australia too, both within the medical profession and speaking on the media, and also in court cases now. So we thank you for your example. We thank you for today, for the historic perspective you've given us. I remember you right at the beginning saying that this was what we were up against, was an ideology, a salvational utopian ideology. And the whole thing does seem to be driven much more by ideology than evidence. And there's a real need to fight back on this. Unfortunately, we have now run out of time. We are at the hour, and we'll have to draw things to a close. Thank you to Professor John Whitehall from Sydney for speaking to us on the subject of managing gender dysphoria in childhood. We could spend a lot more time on this, and the arguments are certainly going to run and run. So thank you, everybody, for attending today, and God bless you.